Across the Arctic Circle, white spheres 3 stories tall sit alone on frozen tundra, with no roads leading to them. The Soviet Union built dozens of these, starting in the 1960s, from the Kola Peninsula to a nuclear test site called Novaya Zemlya. Locals were told to stay away. Soviet maps left the areas blank. Decades later, officials will not confirm what several of them were built for. Some explanations point to radar, built to catch missiles. That does not cover all of them. Some never held radar. One was not built to hide a machine. It was built to hide a city. The ones people actually saw first were in the Komi Republic and along the Kola Peninsula. Soviet engineers built giant spherical shells out of fiberglass panels, each one large enough to swallow a small aircraft hangar. Locals nicknamed them golf balls. Officially, some sites were described as weather stations or scientific installations. Unofficially, they were part of a growing Soviet missile early warning network, built to catch an incoming attack over the shortest possible flight path between the US and the USSR, straight across the pole. The dome itself wasn't really the secret. The antenna spinning inside it was, and the shell existed for one purpose: to keep anyone standing on the ground or flying overhead from getting a clear look at what the equipment inside could actually see. That single design choice tells you something about how seriously the Soviet military was taking the idea that the next war might begin with almost no warning at all. These weren't just instruments tracking weather balloons. They were meant to be the first line of a defense system built around one grim assumption: that a nuclear strike could be minutes away before anyone on the ground knew it was coming. Some of these stations are still active today, folded into newer radar generations that replaced the original Soviet designs after the Cold War ended. Others were quietly decommissioned and simply left standing, with nobody assigned to clear them or tear them down. A handful of explorers who claim to have reached some of these abandoned sites describe empty control rooms, radar frames still bolted into position, and instrument panels stripped of anything useful. None of this has been officially confirmed, and the current operational status of several stations remains genuinely unclear, even to people who study Soviet military infrastructure for a living. The shape built specifically to hide machinery from the sky ended up becoming one of the most photographed silhouettes to come out of the entire Cold War. People have been staring at these domes for decades without knowing exactly what's inside them, and for a number of these sites, that's still true right now, in the present tense. But radar was the easy answer. It's the one Soviet officials were eventually willing to admit to once the Cold War ended and satellite imagery made total secrecy impossible anyway. The next set of dome-shaped structures built across the Arctic weren't hiding radio waves. They were hiding preparation for the single largest man-made explosion in human history. On Novaya Zemlya, a remote Arctic archipelago stretching between the Barents and Kara Seas, the Soviet Union built bunkers, instrument shelters, and hardened command posts around a test site chosen for one specific reason: almost nobody lived there. In 1961, that site hosted the detonation of Tsar Bomba, a hydrogen bomb with a yield thousands of times greater than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. The shockwave reportedly circled the Earth 3 times. Windows shattered hundreds of kilometers away. Most historical accounts describe the archipelago's isolation as a natural advantage, a lucky feature of the map that made it the obvious choice for a test this dangerous. It wasn't entirely natural. The Nenets people, an indigenous population who had lived and herded reindeer across Novaya Zemlya for generations, were relocated before large-scale testing began, so the site could be as empty as the weapons program needed it to be. The Arctic isolation that made Novaya Zemlya useful to Soviet planners wasn't discovered. It was arranged. Novaya Zemlya is still a restricted military zone today, and it still hosts occasional testing activity, according to public reporting over the years. Outsiders can't verify the exact number or current condition of the structures built there during the height of the testing era, and a significant amount of what happened on that archipelago will likely never be confirmed in detail. Decades after hosting the loudest single event in recorded history, this remains one of the most sealed-off places on the planet, and the silence around it isn't an accident of geography. It's policy. Novaya Zemlya proved the Arctic could hide a weapon capable of leveling a city. Soviet planners had bigger ambitions than that. Some of them believed the Arctic could hide an entire city on its own, sealed away from the weather that made the region unlivable in the first place. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Soviet architects floated a concept that reads more like science fiction than urban planning: a fully enclosed, climate-controlled settlement built beneath a single massive dome, sealing out the Arctic cold entirely. Streets, apartment housing, even indoor greenery, all sheltered under one continuous shell, designed to let industrial workers live in relative comfort while extracting oil, gas, and mineral wealth from some of the harshest terrain in Siberia. On paper, this solved a genuine problem. The Soviet economy depended heavily on resources buried beneath permafrost and buried under months of darkness every winter, and keeping a skilled workforce alive and productive out there without losing people to frostbite, isolation, or attrition was a real and expensive engineering challenge. The math never worked. Heating a structure of that scale, sealing it against Arctic wind loads, and maintaining it for decades would have cost more than the resources underneath it were ever worth extracting. Several Soviet architects discussed versions of enclosed dome cities publicly, presenting them as visionary, almost utopian solutions to the problem of permanent Arctic settlement. How far any single specific proposal actually advanced through Soviet planning bureaucracy before being shelved isn't well documented, and some of what survives exists only as sketches and planning studies, rather than approved construction projects. What is clear is the outcome. Not one fully enclosed dome city was ever built at scale anywhere in the Soviet Arctic. The Soviet Union successfully hid a radar system under a dome. It successfully hid a nuclear weapons program behind hardened shelters on an emptied archipelago. The one dome, meant to hide an entire population from the cold itself, never made it past the drafting table. That idea failed before a single wall went up. But real Arctic settlements were built anyway, without domes, without enclosed shells, fully exposed to the exact weather conditions the dome cities were meant to solve. Some of those real towns ended up emptying out just as completely as if the dome city planners had been right to worry in the first place. On the Svalbard archipelago, technically Norwegian territory, but home to a long-standing Soviet mining presence under a historic treaty, the Soviet Union built and operated a coal town called Pyramiden. It had everything a fully functioning socialist settlement was supposed to have: apartment blocks, a cultural palace, a swimming pool, a concert hall, a working farm, and the northernmost bust of Lenin in the world positioned to face out toward a glacier. This wasn't a research camp or a temporary outpost. It was a complete self-sufficient town built explicitly to prove that Soviet industry and Soviet daily life could flourish at the very edge of the map. In 1998, falling global coal prices made the mine unprofitable almost overnight, and the evacuation happened fast enough that workers left books sitting on shelves, sheet music open on stands, and furniture arranged exactly as it had been in use, as though everyone expected to walk back in within the week. Nobody did. Pyramiden today sits essentially empty, kept from total collapse by a small caretaker staff and visited seasonally by small groups on guided tours. The same extreme cold that once made this place brutal to survive in is now the reason it still looks almost exactly the way it did on the day everyone left. Pyramiden emptied because a single resource ran dry. Further along the same Arctic coastline, a town called Dikson emptied for a completely different reason. Dikson was once known as the capital of the Arctic, a genuinely important port and meteorological hub built to support the Northern Sea Route, the shipping corridor connecting European Russia to its Pacific coast through Arctic waters. Apartment blocks were raised there for a population that Soviet planners expected to keep growing for decades, alongside schools, a hospital, and infrastructure meant to make permanent Arctic life feel ordinary rather than extreme. Then the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, and the state subsidies that had made Arctic life financially viable in the first place disappeared along with it almost immediately. Exact figures vary depending on the source and the year cited, but most accounts describe Dikson's population falling from several thousand residents down to a few hundred within a relatively short span of years. Entire sections of housing now stand empty, facing streets with almost nobody left to use them. What remains in Dikson isn't really a monument to Arctic hardship. It's a record of exactly how fast a permanent settlement can unravel once the political system paying for its existence stops paying. Some of these places failed because a resource ran out. Others failed because an entire government stopped existing. But one dome-shaped structure back among the original radar network didn't fail in either of those ways. It simply changed what it was for. Back among the radar sites, one decommissioned station on the Kola Peninsula shows what happens when official secrecy just gets abandoned instead of formally resolved. Its outer shell has torn open in places over the years, exposing the antenna frame that used to sit fully hidden inside it. Decommissioning never came with disclosure, though. The technical specifications of several of these sites were never made public during the Soviet era, and most of that information likely never will surface now, since the relevant records either don't exist publicly or remain restricted. A small number of explorers have reportedly reached structures similar to this one, describing unstable flooring, corroded equipment, and rooms stripped down to bare concrete, though none of these individual accounts have been officially verified by any government agency. The dome was built to hide a machine from view. Decades later, it still hides more than it reveals. It's simply neglect doing the job that deliberate design used to do. Every dome in this story so far was built to keep something out of sight. A radar system, a weapons test, an entire population living somewhere the state needed left empty. The last one on this list wasn't built to hide anything at all. In Anadyr, in Russia's far eastern Arctic, on the opposite side of the country from the Kola Peninsula, stands the Holy Trinity Cathedral, a Russian Orthodox church topped with golden domes, completed in the 2000s. It's frequently cited as one of the most easterly Orthodox cathedrals in the world, and one of the northernmost as well, standing in a region the Soviet Union had spent decades actively trying to secularize and militarize with radar installations, weapons test sites, and industrial company towns. For half a century, structures shaped like this one across the Arctic existed specifically to go unnoticed from the ground and from the air. This one was built to be seen from as far away as possible. It went up after the Soviet collapse, funded in part to help re-establish a religious and cultural identity that had been actively suppressed in the region for generations under Soviet rule. The same general skyline that once held military domes engineered around the idea of invisibility now holds a golden dome engineered around the opposite idea entirely, meant to be photographed, visited, and lit up against the snow rather than hidden from it. It functions today as an active, working cathedral, open to visitors and worshipers, standing over land that used to be defined almost entirely by secrecy rather than by faith. None of these domes were random shapes scattered across empty land by accident. Each one is physical proof of a different future that someone in a position of real power was absolutely certain was coming. The radar domes prove that Soviet planners believed the next war could begin with almost no warning at all. Novaya Zemlya proves they believed clearing an indigenous population off its own land was a reasonable cost for testing the ultimate weapon. The dome city that never got built proves they believed, at least on paper, that the Arctic itself could eventually be made comfortable, if the money and the engineering had ever lined up. Pyramiden and Dikson prove they believed Soviet industry in the far north would simply keep expanding permanently, right up until the exact moment it stopped. Most of that imagined future never arrived. The ideology that funded it collapsed. The money ran out well before the concrete did. The technology moved on to newer systems that didn't need golf ball shells at all. And the country responsible for building nearly all of it stopped existing in 1991. What's left behind isn't really the mystery the title suggests. Most of it has a documented explanation by now, even where the details stay incomplete. What's left is closer to evidence, scattered across a landscape almost nobody visits, of exactly how far a government will go once it's certain about a future that hasn't happened yet. The domes themselves are mostly still standing. Somewhere on the Kola Peninsula right now, a radome built decades ago to conceal a Cold War secret sits with its shell torn open, empty, its original purpose long expired, with nobody left whose actual job it is to explain what it once was.